In a quiet neighborhood where houses lined the narrow streets like neat boxes lived a woman named Carrie. She was in her 20s with long brown hair that she usually wore in a ponytail, and her hands were covered with small scratches from working in a flower shop. Carrie was lonely but not desperate. She loved solitude, walks in the park, and evening movies with popcorn. Her life flowed quietly until she met Mark, a man with broad shoulders, dark eyes, and a smile that seemed sincere but sometimes too intense. Mark was a new neighbor who lived across the street in a house with peeling paint and a sagging porch. He worked as a mechanic, his hands were covered in engine oil, and his clothes smelled of gasoline and metal. They met by chance. Carrie dropped a bouquet of roses, and Mark helped her pick it up by offering coffee at a local cafe. Their first meetings were ordinary, talking about the weather, laughing at old movies, walking under the starry sky. Carrie liked his confidence, but sometimes she noticed how he looked at her for too long, how his fingers gripped the steering wheel of the car when they returned home. One day, Mark proposed a romantic date, dinner at his house, with wine, candles, and dishes that he supposedly cooked himself. Carrie agreed, putting on her best dress and taking a small bouquet of flowers with her as a token of gratitude. Mark's house turned out to be gloomy, with narrow corridors, old wallpaper, and the smell of damp, but she attributed it to his busy schedule. The evening began quietly. They ate pasta, drank wine, and laughed at jokes. But then Carrie noticed that Mark had become nervous. His fingers were shaking as he poured the wine, and his eyes darted around the room as if he was waiting for someone. After dinner, he suggested watching a movie in the basement, where, according to him, there was an old projector. Carrie went down the creaking stairs, holding a glass of wine, but the basement was cold, with stained concrete walls and a musty smell. She heard footsteps, not his, but someone else's, heavy as a grown man's, but there was little light, and she couldn't see who it was. Mark slammed the door shut, and Carrie felt her heart start to pound. She asked what was going on, but he just smiled too broadly and said, "That's part of the surprise." The next day, Carrie returned home, but her phone started ringing from an unknown number. She didn't pick up the phone, but the voice on the answering machine was low, hoarse, repeating her name. "Carrie? Carrie." Her hands trembled, but she thought it was Mark's joke. But the sounds did not subside. Every evening, she heard footsteps outside the window, creaking floorboards, thuds, as if someone was wandering through her house. She bought a night vision camera, a small one with a motion sensor, and installed it in the living room, pointing it at the window. The next morning, after checking the recording, she saw a shadow, indistinct, but moving like a human figure, gliding along the wall, although there was no wind. One day, while checking her mail, Carrie found a note embedded between the bills. The paper was wrinkled and smelled of tobacco, and the text was handwritten in black ink. "Carrie, you shouldn't have come to him. Your hour's now." Her fingers trembled, but she didn't throw the note away. She hid it in a drawer, deciding that it was a mistake. But the footsteps became more frequent, and now laughter mingled with them, low like Mark's, but louder, as if someone else was nearby. Carrie began to be afraid to fall asleep, holding a knife and a phone next to her, but the network often disappeared, and help did not come. One night, when the footsteps became unbearable, she took a camera and a knife, going to the window. The shadow on the recording was moving again, now with something long in its hands, like a stick or a hammer. Carrie noticed how the door to the basement of her house opened, although it was locked twice. She came down, limping on crutches after a recent leg injury, and saw footprints, deep, like from heavy boots, stretching to the basement. There on the floor was a new note taped to the pipe. "Carrie, we're waiting for you. Don't scream." Her fear turned into panic, but she didn't know how to get out of this nightmare. Carrie stood in the basement, clutching a knife in one hand and a night vision camera in the other, her leg in a cast throbbing with pain as she leaned on crutches. Footprints on the floor, deep as from heavy boots, stretched to the pipe, where there was a crumpled note, smelling of tobacco and damp. Her heart was pounding so hard that she could feel it echoing in her chest, but she couldn't let fear get the better of her. She unfolded the note, and her fingers trembled. "Carrie, we are waiting for you. Don't scream." She turned on the camera, pointing it at the basement door, and noticed movement, a shadow, vague but human, sliding along the wall, although there was no one in the basement. Carrie took a step back, and her crutch caught on an old board, causing her to fall to her knees. The cast cracked, sending a sharp pain up her leg, but she didn't scream. She was afraid that the sound would betray her. The footsteps above became louder, heavy like an adult man's, and laughter mingled with them, low, hoarse like Mark's, but louder, as if someone else was nearby. She got up, leaning on the knife, and headed for the stairs, where the light from the flashlight cast long shadows on the walls. There, on the first step, was a new note, crumpled and smelling of earth. "Carrie, you're too close. Open the door." She looked at the door. It was locked with rusty bolts, which she had checked in the morning. But the sound of footsteps grew closer, now from behind the living room door, and Carrie heard the handle turn, even though the lock was on 2 turns. She rushed to the door, but it swung open, and Mark stood in the doorway, tall, with broad shoulders, in a dirty work jacket, with a face covered with scars and dried blood. He was holding a hammer in his hands, a heavy one with a jagged blade covered with something sticky. "You shouldn't have come here," he said hoarsely, stepping forward. Carrie stabbed him in the arm with a knife, and the hammer fell out, plunging into the floor. Mark growled and grabbed her by the hair, but she twisted away, falling to the floor. Her cast cracked harder, and pain shot through her leg, but she managed to hit his knee. The bone cracked and he fell, but instead of screaming, he laughed a low, creepy laugh, as if it were a game. Carrie rushed to the window, but she heard footsteps, heavy, like those of several people. She looked around and saw 2 men and a woman in work jackets with tools. One was holding an axe, the other a canister of gasoline, the third a camera pointed at her. They took their time, as if they knew she wasn't going anywhere. Carrie locked the door, but the axe pierced through the wood, leaving splinters on the floor. She hid in the bedroom, which smelled of old wallpaper and dust, but the sound of footsteps grew louder, and she noticed a camera on the wall, a small one with a red indicator, installed without her knowledge. Someone was watching her, recording her every step. In the bedroom, she found an old closet full of clothes and boxes, and hid inside, huddled against a cold tree. But the whisper came back, now from the pipes, low, hoarse, repeating her name. "Carrie, Carrie." She took out her phone to call for help, but the network was gone, and the battery was flashing red. Then she noticed a new note on the shelf, taped to her clothes. "Carrie, you're ours. Don't hide." Her fingers trembled, but she heard the bedroom door open and heavy footsteps enter. The axe hit the cabinet, splitting the wood, and Carrie jumped out, hitting the man with the axe with the hammer. His fingers cracked, blood splattered on the walls, but he screamed, and the woman with the camera laughed as she recorded her escape. Carrie ran out the back door, but the field behind the house was empty, just dry grass and bushes. Her leg hurt so much that she could barely move, but she heard the shots. Not close, but enough to know they wouldn't stop. She hid behind a tree. A small drone with a camera and a spotlight hovered over her, illuminating her bloodied face. A voice came from a speaker. "Carrie, you can't hide. We're recording your every move." She threw a rock at the drone, and it fell, but immediately a new one appeared with a brighter light. Carrie pressed herself against the tree, feeling the dry bark scratch her back, and the cast on her leg pressing down, sending a sharp pain up her body. The drone hovering above her illuminated her bloodied face with a bright spotlight, and the same hoarse voice came from the speaker. "Carrie, you can't hide. We're recording your every move." Her heart was beating so hard that she could hear its echo in her ears, but she couldn't move. Her leg refused to obey, and the crutches were left in the house. Blood from the torn cast flowed across the grass, mixing with dirt, and the skin on his knee hung in rags, exposing a wound where the bone was visible. 3 men came out of the darkness of the field, Mark with an axe, a woman with a camera, and another man tall, with a bald head, holding a pistol. Their faces were covered with dirt and dried blood, their eyes empty, like those who had long lost their humanity, but their movements were precise, like hunters. Mark stepped closer, his axe gleaming in the spotlight, covered in rust and marks Carrie didn't want to recognize. The woman filmed Carrie's every move, pointing the camera at her trembling face like a victim in a reality show. Carrie started to run, limping, but the axe plunged into the ground in front of her, kicking up a fountain of sand and mud. She fell, hitting her shoulder, and felt her skin tear, blood trickling down her sleeve. She crawled, clinging to the roots, but the bullet from a man's pistol plunged into the ground nearby, showering her with fragments of bark. Carrie screamed, but immediately fell silent when she heard a whisper, now not from the pipes, but from behind her, low as a breath on her neck, repeating, "Carrie? Carrie?" She turned around, but saw no one, only the shadows of the trees and the drone, which approached, illuminating her bloody hands. Laughter came from the speaker, low and eerie, as if someone was enjoying her fear. "You are our star," the voice said, and Mark raised the axe, preparing to strike. Carrie hit him with a rock she found in the grass, breaking his nose. Blood splattered, drenching his face and the ground, but he didn't stop, just laughed like a madman and hit her leg with an axe. The blade cut into flesh, splitting bone with a crunch that echoed across the field. Blood gushed out, drenching the grass, and the meat tore open, exposing tendons and crushed bones. Carrie screamed, but her voice was cut off when a bullet from a pistol hit her shoulder, tearing her muscles. She fell down, gasping in pain, but the drone continued to shoot, bringing the camera closer to her face, eyes full of tears, mouth distorted with agony. The woman with the camera laughed, her voice high-pitched, almost childlike, but cold as ice. "It's beautiful," she said, and Mark chopped off her other leg. The meat flew apart, the bones cracked, the blood flooded the field like a red river. Carrie was still breathing, wheezing, her consciousness fading from pain and loss of blood, but she heard a whisper, now from the bushes low, repeating her name. "Carrie? Carrie." A man with a gun splashed gasoline on her body, the smell of fuel mixed with blood and dirt, causing nausea. The woman with the camera approached, filming how gasoline was running down her skin, how the wounds were bleeding, how Carrie's eyes were glassy with fear. Mark raised the axe, preparing for another blow, but Carrie was still clinging to life, clutching the ground with bloody fingers. The drone, still hovering, recorded every detail, the blood, the wounds, her trembling body. Laughter came from the speaker. "You're our new act, Carrie. Get ready for the finals." They surrounded her, shooting from different angles, like directors on a movie set. The woman bent down, took her phone, checked her notes, and said, "We know everything about you. Your house, your habits, your fears." Mark raised the axe above his head, preparing for the final blow, but Carrie was still breathing, wheezing, her eyes staring at the drone, at the camera, at those faces that didn't stop. The man's gun paused, aiming at her head, and the shovel he held at the ready was ready to plunge into her stomach. But at that moment, the drone hovered closer, and a voice from a speaker said, "The end is coming, Carrie. You are our masterpiece. You said yes, which, according to your rules, means the continuation of the story. The title remains From Date Night to Fright Night, True Horror Stories You Won't Believe, translation, from a romantic date to a night of horror, real scary stories you won't believe. I'll take your requirements into account. No mysticism, just reality, American style, full of tin. I'll add even more terrible details with harassment, surveillance via drones, whispers, and tension, like in the movie. I continue in Russian with 7,000 characters, variety, and details, but I will stop before the most terrible ending so that you can say the end to finish. I am writing in full text without chapters." Carrie was lying on the grass, bloodied, with torn legs, arm and chest, the skin on which hung in rags, and bones sticking out of the wounds like white daggers. Her breathing was hoarse, ragged, and each breath was accompanied by the gurgling of blood in her throat, mixed with gasoline, which burned her wounds. The drone hovering above her illuminated her face with a bright spotlight, recording every detail: sweat, tears, blood flowing on the grass, and the charred edges of her skin where gasoline had already begun to act. Laughter came from the speaker, low, creepy, like those who enjoyed her suffering, mixed with whispers. "Carrie? Carrie?" Her eyes filled with horror followed the four figures surrounding her. Mark with an axe, a woman with a camera, a man with a gun, and another man with a shovel, whose faces were empty, covered with dirt and scars, like those who had long ceased to be human. Mark, tall, with broad shoulders and scars on his face, froze, holding an axe over her chest, ready to strike, but stopped when he heard a new sound, a helicopter returning from a sky, descending lower, illuminating the field with a spotlight. A voice came from the drone speaker. "Keep her alive for another minute. This is the climax." The woman with the camera laughed, her voice high-pitched, almost childlike, but cold as ice. "It's beautiful," she said, pointing the lens closer to Carrie's face, capturing her dilated pupils, tears streaming down her cheeks, and blood drenching the grass. A man with a shovel splashed gasoline on her body, the smell of fuel mixed with blood and dirt, making Carrie feel sick. She tried to move, but her torn legs and arm wouldn't obey. The meat was torn, the bones were sticking out, the skin sagged like a rag. She was wheezing, gasping for breath, but the drone continued filming, bringing the camera closer to her mouth, where blood bubbled with every breath. A new whisper came from a speaker. "Carrie, don't resist. This is your ending." Her eyes darted to the drone. then to the figures, and she noticed how a woman with a camera held a microphone to her face, recording her breathing, hoarse, ragged, full of agony. Carrie gathered her last strength, hitting the woman with a stone found in the grass, breaking her nose. Blood splattered, flooding the camera lens, but Mark didn't give her time. He brought the axe down on her chest, but not deeply, only cutting through the skin so that the blood flowed in a thin trickle. The pain was unbearable. The meat tore and Carrie screamed, but her voice was drowned out by the laughter of a man with a shovel who splashed gasoline on the wound, intensifying the burning. The skin on her chest was bubbling, charred from the interaction with the fuel, but she was still breathing, wheezing, clutching the ground with bloody fingers. The man with the gun raised the barrel, aiming at her head, but at that moment a new man descended from the helicopter, a man with short hair and scars on his arms, holding a second gun. His face was calm, almost emotionless, but his eyes sparkled like those of a man possessed. "Leave her to me," he said, and Mark stepped back, lowering the axe. The woman with the camera laughed, pointing the lens at the new man, who splashed more gasoline with a shovel, preparing to set it on fire. Carrie felt her consciousness fade from pain and blood loss, but she still heard a whisper, now from the bushes low, repeating her name. "Carrie? Carrie." Her eyes looked at the guns, at the drone, at those faces that didn't stop. The man with the gun stepped closer, raised his weapon, aiming at her leg, and fired. The bullet tore through the flesh, the meat flew apart, the bone cracked, and blood gushed out like a fountain, flooding the grass. Carrie screamed, but her voice was cut off when the second shot hit her arm, tearing through muscles and bones. The man with the shovel raised the tool, preparing to plunge it into her stomach, but the new man with the gun stopped him. "Take your time. This is our best shot." He held a microphone up to Carrie's face, recording her wheezing, weak, gurgling, full of agony. The drone approached, its camera focused on her horrified eyes, and a voice from the speaker said, "The end is coming, Carrie. You are our masterpiece." The axe, shovel, and pistols froze around her, ready for the final blow. But at that moment the helicopter hovered lower, and ropes for people with tools descended from it. Carrie was still breathing, wheezing. Her body was covered in blood, gasoline, and dirt. Her legs and arms were torn. Her chest was bleeding, but she was alive. On the verge, but alive. The drone continued filming, its camera recording every movement, and laughter came from the speaker. "You're our number 9. The next act is ready." The man with the gun raised the barrel, aiming at Carrie's head, but did not fire, allowing fear to flood her mind. The shovel and axe hovered over her body, ready for the final blow, and the whispers from the bushes grew louder. "Carrie? Carrie?" Carrie was lying on the grass, bloodied, with torn legs, arm, and chest, the skin on which hung in rags, and bones sticking out of the wounds like white daggers. Her breathing was hoarse, ragged, and each breath was accompanied by the gurgling of blood in her throat, mixed with gasoline, which burned her wounds. The drone hovering above her illuminated her face with a bright spotlight, recording every detail: sweat, tears, blood flowing on the grass, and the charred edges of her skin where gasoline had already begun to act. Laughter came from the speaker, low, creepy, like those who enjoyed her suffering, mixed with whispers. "Carrie? Carrie?" Her eyes, filled with horror, followed the 4 figures surrounding her: Mark with an axe, a woman with a camera, a man with a gun, and a man with a shovel, whose faces were empty, covered with dirt and scars, like those who had long ceased to be human. A man with a gun, with short hair and scars on his arms, raised the barrel, aiming at Carrie's head, and fired. The bullet shattered her skull, the meat shattered, the bones cracked, and blood sprayed like a fountain, flooding the grass, the camera, and the faces of all 3. Her brain, wet and red, fell out onto the ground, mixing with blood, and her eyes popped out of their sockets, remaining on stalks full of horror. The drone continued filming, bringing the camera closer to her shattered head, capturing every shard of bone, every piece of flesh, every drop of blood trickling down the grass. But it wasn't the end. Mark Tall, with broad shoulders and scars on his face, raised an axe and brought it down on her neck, severing her head with a crunch that echoed across the field. The meat exploded, the bones split, blood gushed out in a river, flooding the ground, and Mark's hands, the skin sagged like a rag. Carrie's head fell. Her eyes were still open, full of agony. Her mouth was frozen in a silent scream, and blood was running down the grass, mixing with ash from gasoline. The woman with the camera laughed, recording how the flesh tore, how the bones fell out, how the skin charred from a fire that began to lick the body. A man with a shovel splashed gasoline on her remains, and the smell of fuel mixed with blood and dirt, causing nausea. He flicked the lighter, and the fire broke out, devouring Carrie's body. The skin cracked, the meat sizzled, the bones turned black, until only ashes and charred fragments remained. Flames licked at her face, charring what was left of her eyes, nose, and mouth, leaving only embers and smoke. A woman with a camera filmed how the fire devoured the field, how the grass hissed as Carrie's bones smoldered, turning to dust. But they didn't stop. A man with an axe began to dismember her charred remains. He cut off her hand, the meat tore, the bone cracked, blood mixed with ashes splattered on the grass. The woman with the camera laughed, recording how the flesh tore, how the bones fell out, how the skin charred completely. The second man splashed more gasoline, intensifying the flames, and the fire engulfed the field, devouring everything. Grass, trees, Carrie's remains. Her charred bones sizzled, her skin cracked, and the smell of burnt flesh mixed with smoke rising to the sky like a distress signal. The drone, still hovering, recorded how the flames devoured the field, and laughter came from the speaker. Carrie is our number 9. The next act begins. They packed her charred remains into a suitcase, the same as the ones in the house, and attached a note written in blood. Carrie, you are the star of our show. A helicopter hovering over the field lowered the rope, and they flew away, leaving the field on fire, smoke rising into the sky as a grim reminder. But the next day, someone found a suitcase in the Woodsay girl with a backpack and a flashlight. She opened it, saw ashes, bones, blood, and her face turned pale. Inside was a new note written in blood, "You're next if you're watching." She dropped her suitcase and ran, but the drone hovering over her turned on the spotlight, and a voice from the speaker said, "Welcome to the game." The network, which watched everything through drones, cameras, and helicopters, continued to work, turning fear, blood, and death into a business show where every scream, every shot, and every murder were mounted and sold to those who paid for such terrifying moments. Carrie became part of their collection, but her death was not the last, and the field where she died became a new scene for their nightmare, where the next victim was already waiting in the wings.